I think our passage for this morning is familiar to many of us. There isn't much to this story, and yet I think that the underlying message here is both radical and profound. This is a story about children, but it is also a story about all of us. It's a story about belonging, welcome, and the fundamental work of the church. Then the little children were brought to him in order that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples spoke sternly to those who brought them, but Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs." And he laid his hands on them and went on his way. That's it. That's the whole story. Seems simple enough. People brought their children to Jesus so that he could bless them. The disciples thought that Jesus really had better things to do with his time. Jesus disagreed. The details are really quite simple, but the implication of this story for us today is anything but simple. We can get clues to the deeper meaning of this story from the context for this passage. Right before this story, in Matthew 19, verses 1 through 12, Jesus talks about divorce. This passage on divorce, along with others from the Gospels, are often used to suggest that Christians should not be allowed to get divorces. And although that is certainly one way to interpret that passage, I believe that a more accurate reading of this passage has to do with justice for women. The passage specifically says that a man cannot get a divorce from a woman unless it is under very specific circumstances. Divorced women at Jesus' time, and honestly, under some circumstances still today, would often be left destitute and as social outcasts. I believe that this passage about divorce essentially boils down to Jesus telling his disciples that they cannot simply cast aside a woman when they grew bored of her. The literal meaning of this passage may or may not be applicable today, but the meaning underneath this passage remains strong and true. We are not to dehumanize and dismiss others. Relationships should be cherished, and above all else, human dignity is to be respected. Fundamentally, I believe that this passage about divorce is a passage about justice. The passage that comes directly after the story of Jesus with the children is also useful to consider. Matthew 19, verses 16 to 30 is the story of the rich young man who comes to Jesus to ask him how he should live a holy life. Jesus tells him to follow the commandments and also to sell all of his possessions. It's kind of a high bar. The story ends with this verse, "But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first." I'll say that again. Many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. So if we look at chapter 19 as a whole, first the readings, the teaching on divorce, and then the story of Jesus with the little children, and then the story of the wealthy young man, we see a theme arise. And the theme is this, that the first will be last and the last will be first. The theme is that even those who the world deems to be insignificant are significant to God. God will raise up the lowly. God cares about justice for the weak and the unprotected. God cares about the equitable distribution of wealth. God cares about children. Archbishop Desmond Tutu retells this story in his illustrated children's Bible, and he retells it like this. Jesus spent many hours teaching people about God and how God loves all of us. One day when Jesus was tired and resting, some parents arrived with their children. The children were giggling and laughing and running around making noise, while their parents asked the disciples if they could speak with Jesus. "What do you want with the Master?" asked the disciples. "We want him to bless our children." "The Master is resting," the disciples said. "You can't bother him now. Go home." But Jesus heard them. "Do not chase away the children," he called. "Let them come to me." God loves children. And when they smile, God smiles. And when they laugh, God laughs. And when they cry, God cries. And Jesus went to the children, and they laughed and played together for a while. He took them in his arms and he hugged them. He placed his hands on their heads and he blessed them. And then he told the disciples, "Everyone who wants to see God's dream come true must see with the eyes of a child." I love this retelling because it points to the truth in this passage. The truth is that God does love every child. But it isn't just children that God loves, right? God loves each and every one of us, each of us. And when we smile, God smiles. And when we laugh, God laughs. And when we cry, God cries. And if we want to live into the kingdom of heaven, into God's dream of justice and peace and plenty for all, then we must see life through others' eyes. Yes, we must try and see life through the eyes of a child. But we also must try and see life through the eyes of those who struggle under the burden of poverty. We must try and see life through the eyes of women who face sexism and oppression. We must try and see through the eyes of those fighting addictions and those who experience violence. It is only through compassionately putting ourselves in the place of others that we can live into God's dream. And this passage provides us with a path to do that. We can see through the eyes of a child only if we fully welcome children into our community. We can only see through their eyes if we live in relationship with them. And the same is true for all of our brothers and sisters in this world. We can only see through the eyes of a person struggling with poverty if we welcome that person into our community and into our life. We can only see through the eyes of somebody struggling with addiction if we welcome that person, fully welcome that person into our community. Fundamentally, this passage is about welcome. It is about being willing to welcome and love those who may be different from us. Our ability to build the kingdom of heaven, to live into God's dream, is completely contingent upon us welcoming everyone into loving fellowship. It is completely contingent upon us building relationships and authentic connections. Friends, let us take the truth of this passage into our time of waiting worship. Let us hold in prayer this profound story of welcome, love, and hope. I would invite you, if you feel called to speak, to stand in body or in spirit and speak from the silence.